This to me is the scariest part about UGA football right now for the rest of college football. Like to come in and talk about the scary parts about Georgia football. Right now, I think it's the fact that the Dogs haven't played a complete game. They haven't. That should concern the rest of the country. If you are watching Georgia on tape, if you're Florida, Ole Miss, Tennessee, the teams that are coming up that I think Georgia's better than, and we'll see. The SEC has been very competitive. Georgia can lose any of those games. But the fact that Georgia hasn't played a complete game, I think should be a little bit scary on tape because you've seen them do what they need to do in all these different parts of games. You've seen them be successful in one area or this area for one game or different in a different game. And then you think about, oh man, well, what if they put it all together? What if Kirby, Bobo, Schumann, this staff, Carson Beck, the receivers, what if they put it all together? Because they have it. And they just beat the number one team on the road at night in a hostile environment by multiple scores. And they didn't play a complete game, in my opinion, if you ask me. What is a complete game? Let's define that first. Statistically, there's not a barometer. It's more so, hey, well, good execution in the pass and run game for me, a complete game. Good execution in the pass and the run game for most of 4 quarters. And on defense, limiting the pass and the run. On special teams, being effective. To me, that's a complete game. You can look across and doing it for, like I said, the majority of the game. It doesn't have to be all 4 quarters in the whole thing, but just really grinded it out. So let's look through, determine that Georgia hasn't played a complete game, and talk about how scary that is. Ryan Curley from Dawg Post, hey, real quick, I'm going to pump 2 things. I'm not going to pump both of them at the same time. The red zone. If you want shirts like this that are very comfortable, that's not UGA merchandise, the red zone is one of the only places that you can get that in Athens. You want Athens shirts, you want some other stuff, you want some Braves gear, you can go to the red zone. It's on Clayton Street in downtown Athens. Thank you. Against Clemson, 34-3. Looks like a complete game when you look at that box score, right? Took Georgia a long time to get rolling on offense. You can argue that this was closer to a complete game than a lot of these other ones. If you want to say that, I'm not going to argue with you on that. I think that you're right. Georgia played really well in all phases of the game against Clemson, just not for the whole game. Like literally in the first half, Georgia could not score on offense. They had a hard time driving the ball down the field, right? It resulted, I think 6-3 was the halftime score. You see my point there? And then they explode for the 28 points in the second half. Played a complete game in the second half. Obviously, the defense was suffocating the entire time. The defense was very good. Clemson only really put together a couple of drives. But that was in a neutral site, Atlanta, against a pretty good opponent in Clemson, who is one of the best teams in the ACC. Tennessee Tech, we'll glaze over that. I didn't think it was a complete game. I thought that Georgia's run defense was not as stifling as you would think it would be against a team that's way worse than it in Tennessee Tech. I thought that passing-wise, it was a good game. Running, they did have a few explosive runs, but defensively, I thought that Georgia could have played better against Tennessee Tech. Kentucky was bad, right? I don't think this Kentucky team is very good. Dean talks about how their defense is very good. Look, South Carolina hung 30 on them. Florida just hung 40 on them. They lost to, I can't even remember, but Kentucky has a losing record at this point. And it was a 13-12 game where, guess what? Georgia did not run the ball effectively. There was one drive where they ran it effectively. Branson Robinson capped it off with a touchdown. ETN had a 17 to 20-yard gain on it. Other than that, it was pretty slow, and it took until the fourth quarter, really, for Carson Beck to get some things rolling with his receivers, and they had to put together a game-winning drive and hold off Kentucky. Defensively, it was a very good game, yet they got the ball ran on them again. Kentucky runs for, look, it's not atypical to run for over 100 yards, and it's not necessarily atypical for Georgia to allow that. It was the way it looked, and you see that and you're like, whoa, Kentucky is gaining momentum on the ground. It's part of why Georgia was struggling, because Kentucky had a good time of possession in that game. Alabama, obviously it wasn't a complete game. Carson Beck has 5 turnovers. If you count that safety as well, I believe that would count as a turnover, the intentional grounding safety. The receivers and Carson Beck weren't on the same page. Georgia couldn't run the ball. They only run for about 80 yards total in that game. Obviously, split that between the halves. It's not amazing. And it just took a very long time for it to get rolling. They lost. They lost because they didn't play a complete game. They allowed Milroe to run all over them. They allowed Milroe to throw it over the top. And they still almost won. They lost that game, 41-34. They had the lead late in that game. They allowed that final touchdown. It wasn't a complete game. It was a game where Georgia had to scrap its way back in, and they almost won. Against Auburn, this was not an incomplete game necessarily, but it was vanilla, and that's fine. It's fine if it's vanilla out there. I heard something out there. 31-13. Georgia ran the ball better, right? They ran the ball a little bit better. Carson Beck played a clean game. Carson Beck doesn't have to throw for 300 yards. Carson Beck doesn't have to throw for 3 or 4 touchdowns. But a clean game is what you want out of him. And what they did there was, I want to get his stat line for this one because I don't want to misspeak. But I believe that his final stat line ended up being 23 for 29, 240 yards and 2 touchdowns. That is all you need out of the passing game. If the run game puts up 140 yards, ETN 16 carries, 88 yards, 2 touchdowns. Offensively, this is what you want, and it was a slow burn win for Georgia that the fans thought was boring. Look, it was boring, but that's what they needed to get that game over with. Against Mississippi State, it wasn't a complete game because in the second half, the defense started allowing Mississippi State to get things rolling. That's why it ends up being a 10-point game. This could have been a blowout, that Mississippi State game. 41-31 was not quite indicative of how the whole game went. Georgia was suffocating Mississippi State. It was the second half. They started getting things rolling. Carson Beck threw for 450 yards. He was throwing all over the place. Georgia didn't run the ball super well against Mississippi State, and the defense was getting tricked by Van Buren. I forget his first name. By Van Buren. Faked out Dalen Everett. That caused a touchdown. They get a long touchdown where Daniel Harris was beat. It was a game where the Georgia defense played well until it started to not play well, and all of a sudden Mississippi State was clawing itself back into the game. Before I talk about Texas in depth here for the next couple of minutes, make sure you are looking at the link down below. It is the Dawg Post newsletter. We're going to keep cranking out content even though it's the bye week for Georgia. It was a huge game this weekend, and there's a lot to talk about, and we'll be talking about that on the website all week long. Make sure you're checking out our newsletter down below. Again, Ryan Coyer from Dawg Post, thanking you for checking that out. Texas, 30-15. Ryan, that wasn't a complete game? No, it wasn't. It wasn't a complete game. Why? Carson Beck, multiple interceptions, 3 of them. 2 of them for sure. That third one was on that reverse call, which was bizarre, and that's a whole nother thing to talk about, but passing game was not great. The receivers were dropping balls. And simply, if that part of it was better, maybe we are talking about a different score here, because defensively, man, that was a really, really good game defensively, right? Forcing turnovers. 3 fumbles forced and recovered, an interception, suffocating defense. Texas only ran for, and part of this is out of desperation, you're throwing the ball more, but Texas only ran for 29 yards. Defensively, a complete football game. Offensively, the one missing piece was the passing game execution, which was on both Beck and the receivers. So then I say this to you. What is the score of that game? What does that game look like if Carson Beck and the receivers are firing on all cylinders and everything else is working? ETN is finally rolling. Are we talking about a monumental blowout? And by monumental, I say like a 30-point blowout of the number 1 team on the road. That's what I'm talking about, guys. The closest game they played to complete is probably, in terms of just start to finish, we're going to win this game, we're going to do it by scoring and stopping you, is probably that Auburn game when you're throwing out the Tennessee Tech game. But this was by far the most impressive win. And there was one huge phase of it that wasn't working at a high level. And that's what I mean. If all things are playing at a high level, I don't know if you could beat this Georgia team, because on the road at Kentucky, they won in not a hostile environment necessarily, but in a tough situation where they're not playing well and they had to gut it out. They almost gutted it out against Alabama in the most hostile situation they'll face in the entire season. And they did gut it out. They didn't have to gut it out. They beat Texas. It wasn't a fight for Texas. They beat Texas. What you've got next is Florida. Tough game, all right? But Georgia should win that game. Then at Ole Miss. And then they're done going on the road. They can stay at home and win the games that they should. At Ole Miss is that next thing. Ole Miss's crowd is going to be nothing like Texas or Alabama or Tennessee last year, where most of these players, and Auburn last year. Ole Miss's environment, and I haven't been there, doesn't shape up to that. Georgia not playing complete football and still beating up on really, really good football teams. That should scare other teams.